Hello, everyone. Welcome to Facebook Live with the Horticulturists. We're back for the 2020 version of the show. Glad to be back. We've taken a couple weeks off. We're glad to be back to answer your gardening questions. My name is Candace Hart. I'm the State Master Gardener Specialist for U of I Extension here in Central Illinois. My specialty is definitely flowers, so growing cut flowers, annuals, perennials. I'm all about the flowers. And I have a couple of colleagues here today who grow different things than I do.
My name is Kelly Alsip, and I am a horticulture educator based out of Bloomington. So I do serve 3 different counties, Livingston, McLean, and Woodford. My specialty is insects mostly, but I like to dabble in the vegetables and fruits like Ryan does, and just overall, I have an opinion on everything. Horticulture.
Stay tuned.
And that's good. That's good. My name is Ryan Panko. I'm a horticulture educator with U of I Extension based out of Champaign. So I serve Ford, Iroquois, Vermilion, and Champaign counties. My background is in trees and woody plants. I'm a forester and an arborist, so that's my first area of expertise. But like Kelly, I like to grow vegetables and fruits and things. So in my free time, I like to do a lot of that. And native plants are another big interest of mine. So anything native is usually what I'm into, unless it's a vegetable.
Very cool. Okay, well, if you're new to our show, if you've never joined us live before, we take questions throughout the show. So if you have gardening questions of any kind, you can add them into the chat box there, and we'll answer those kind of as we go through today. But we also kind of pick a topic or a theme for the show this year. And today's topic is pruning, because winter is a great time to be thinking about pruning. And like Ryan said, he's our tree guy, so he has a lot of great knowledge on pruning of all kinds. So I think we're going to start off talking a little bit about pruning. So if you have questions, start thinking about them, adding them into the comment box, and we're going to address those today.
Yeah, so especially pruning questions, but other plant questions. So really anything that we might help you guys with. But this is the time of year that we typically look to prune trees and shrubs. And with respect to plant health, this is the best time of the year because the plants are dormant. Pathogens are typically dormant this time of year. And so great time to do some of that pruning that you need to do. So I've had our tech folks have uploaded some slides of a presentation of mine. So we're going to run through a few of those slides and look at just the basics of how you make a proper pruning cut. And it's a little more tricky than you might think. But it's something that's pretty easy to learn and pick up on. Just how to make that basic cut. Now, applying those cuts to an entire tree canopy or an entire shrub becomes a little more tricky, and that's kind of where it's an art and science, pruning is. That's kind of where the art comes in, and that takes some practice and just some repetition. But today, to start with, let's start by looking at this first slide that kind of shows us a proper pruning cut. So in this slide here, we have a little figure up in the upper right out of the Master Gardener Manual that shows us, a proper pruning cut. So the little figure labeled B there shows where you would make the proper pruning cut. But on A there, you can see a branch stub sticking off. You can see a little bit of rumply bark at the base of that branch stub, and that is what we call the branch collar. On some species, it is really visible. On other species, it's sometimes difficult to see. So it depends on the tree. It depends on the angle of the branch union that you're looking at, and a lot of different things. So the first thing to do in making a proper pruning cut is to identify that branch collar. If you look in the lower right of that figure, you see a crabapple branch that has a really well-defined branch collar, and you can see there's a dotted red line there that kind of shows about where you would cut. So some folks have a tendency to cut much closer to the trunk. So when we do that, we take off some of that branch collar tissue. And that branch collar tissue is actually what is going to grow around that pruning wound that we've made. So trees, unlike humans, cannot regenerate the tissue around that cut. Instead, they grow over that area or seal over it. We don't say trees heal because we as humans can heal wounds. Trees seal over those wounds. So if we remove that callus tissue, we remove some of the tree's ability to seal over that wound as quickly. Now, trees are resilient. If you cut a little too far into that callus tissue, they will regenerate. They will grow some new callus tissue. It just takes time, and the whole time that pruning wound is open, that's an opportunity for pathogens and other things to enter, and we can cause some problems that way. So that's kind of a great textbook example of a really easy to see branch collar. What if you can't see the branch collar? So there's actually a method in the next slide that we've uploaded. There's a method to how you might find a branch collar. So in this case, this is a picture of, at the right is a crabapple tree with 2 codominant stems. So it's kind of an unrealistic pruning cut that we would cut off one or the other of these two, but it illustrates well how when branches are codominant, you cannot see that branch collar tissue very well. So how do we find where to estimate? I mean, those cells are in this tree trunk right here. They're hidden in there. They're not as easy to see, but they're there. So there's a way that we can estimate about where to cut to know that we're leaving the branch collar there and not cutting into it. And so the first thing we do on this slide, number 1, is identify the branch bark ridge. And you can see in the picture at the right there, there's a little red line I've drawn right down the branch bark ridge. So you can see that's present on every branch union on every tree. Again, some species it's easy to see, some species it's not as easy to see.
On the
but
bark, probably, kind of.
Depends on the bark character, depends on the angle of the branch, how easy it is to see. But anyway, start by identifying the branch bark ridge. On the next slide, you'll see I've drawn a 90-degree angled line off of that branch bark ridge. So that's the second step, and that helps you kind of visualize this. Now, in the field, you don't have a marker where you're going to draw these lines. So that's why these figures kind of help illustrate how you would imagine this, or an easy way to break it down mentally as you're looking at each one of these. So as we move to number 3 on this slide, we're actually going to bisect that 90-degree angle by 45 degrees. So we're cutting it in half. And that's actually the line that we would make our final cut along. So that dotted orange line there is where we make the final cut. Now, an easier way to describe this is to find the branch bark ridge and make a cut at 45 degrees off of it. Well, for me, that's always been more difficult to do than kind of to imagine this 90-degree angle and to bisect it. So there's different ways you can kind of accomplish this, but let's take a look at it on a more realistic cut we might do. So this next slide shows us a couple different branches on red buds. And you'll see throughout these slides, there's quite a few slides of red buds. I've done some red bud pruning this winter. So anyway, at the left we have what I think is you can kind of see the branch union on that branch. To me, that's pretty easy to see, right at the base of the branch. It kind of flares out there as it goes into the trunk. So, but at the right, that's difficult to see. So on our next slide, I've actually drawn on our left red bud where the cut should probably be made. And on the right, you can see that same kind of calculation of 45 degrees to kind of estimate that cut. So at the beginning, when you can't see that branch collar, estimating this 45 degrees is something you may spend some time really kind of contemplating before you make the cut. After a while, and after you've done it enough, and after you've looked at a lot of these cuts that you've made, it should start to come kind of automatic. Or you can get close enough. You know, we don't have to be exactly right on. In this case, the main thing is that we want to leave the callus tissue. We don't want to actually cut into the callus tissue. I'm always okay with going a little outside the callus, but to not leave that tissue, I think, really can hurt things. So, the next slide here has a white oak twig and a redbud twig, and as you can see on twigs, it's a little more difficult to find that branch color region. You can definitely see changes in color. To me, on the white oak twig, on the twig that's branching off to the left out of that, I can really see a little bit of a collar tissue there. I can see that wrinkly bark. So that kind of stands out. That shows me where I can make the cut. On the redbud, it's a little more difficult for me to see. I guess I do see an orange color there. That's maybe some of that collar tissue. But fact of the matter is, twigs have less of that tissue form. So a lot of times it's hard to see. This next slide, I really like how it illustrates how to make a cut on a twig. So this is out of a horticultural manual that I found this picture. And I love how it shows from, D and E are kind of the proper cuts that we would make. But let's talk about what's wrong with A, B, and C. So, Kelly, when you look at A, I'll bet you can tell right away what's wrong with A. What?
It's a stub cut.
It's a stub cut. So we've left a stub there on that one. So it's going to take a while for that branch collar to grow around that stub. Think about how long that would take. Probably the stub is going to rot off before this plant can
just gonna sit there and not
just
do
sit there and rot. And so when that rot goes back into the stem, that's a big problem. So that's a problem with stub cuts. On B, they've actually cut probably right at where that branch union would be. But in the case of twigs, that's probably going to desiccate that bud. That bud is just so close to the cut, it's going to dry out. And so we'd actually want to do something along the lines of D where we leave just a little tiny bit. And that's just to keep that drying action from acting upon that bud too heavily and drying it out. So in the case of C, they've just missed their angle a little bit. That's what I call a dog ear. So they just haven't quite got that angle right and left a little bit. And then in E there, that's just an example of the same kind of cut on a U branch of a U shrub, and just leaving a little bit of tissue there above that branch or that bud. So
it's a good graphic, yeah.
So that's kind of the basics of how to make your basic pruning cut.
Nice.
Are we any questions that folks have already?
Not yet on pruning. So if you have anything on pruning, feel free to add them to the chat box. I think that's good to point out because I think a lot of people assume, especially when you're making a cut on a larger tree, that, I need to make a flush cut to the trunk just so it looks clean. I don't leave anything behind. So I think that's good to point out that it's kind of, I don't think a lot of people would assume that they should be doing it this way.
Yeah, I mean, I see a lot of improper pruning cuts, and it's usually because it's cut too close or they've just left a giant stub.
Too much of either too much or
so
or not enough.
It's not intuitive to cut at that branch collar, and it takes a little bit of paying attention, a little bit of concentration to get the skills down. But once you do, it's you start to see it on every limb that you prune usually. Well, before we head into, we do have some more slides to talk about how wounds heal and the long-term effects of our pruning cuts. But while we're talking about just the basics of making a pruning cut, I brought some tools in to look at today. So the first thing, why don't you go ahead and demonstrate that to the folks, Kelly? That's a pair of hand pruners.
Yes.
Our favorite kind of hand
And
pruner.
that's my favorite style. There's a ton of different companies that sell them like that, but the bottom line with hand pruners is you want a pair that actually has a bypass cutting method. And so with these, that cutting blade actually bypasses the part that it cuts against. Whereas there's an old style of pruners that they still sell in stores today that are called anvil style pruners, where they actually smash into that other part that they cut against. Whereas those that Kelly hold, they bypass, so they bypass by the other side. So that's going to make your cleanest pruning cut. So when we think about how these wounds do seal over, remember they don't heal, they seal. When we think about how they seal over, the cleaner the cut we can make, the better opportunity that tree has to seal over nicely or recover from that cut. So when I'm doing pruning, this is my first choice. If I could do all my cuts with hand pruners, that would be my first choice. The next step up from hand pruners are loppers. And so loppers allow you to cut just a little bit larger of a diameter of a limb. And you can see they work very similar to these bypass pruners. You would also want a pair of bypass loppers. And those work well up to maybe about 2-inch size diameter, and then we get up to some of the saws that we might need. And so Kelly's pulled out just a basic hand saw. Nowadays, most all hand saws have a turbo cutting action. That's what it was marketed as when this first came out, maybe a few decades ago. But there's 2 rows of teeth, so on each stroke of that saw, you get some cutting action out of those teeth, where a lot of our old saws only cut in one direction, and they make not quite as clean of a cut, and they don't cut as efficiently. So if you have a really old hand saw that you've just used for years, it may be worth upgrading to one of these newer saws. Just about any hand saw you would buy in any gardening center has this 2 rows of teeth and does the dual cutting action. So, nice. But again, this is a little bit rougher of a cut than our hand pruners or our loppers. So this is kind of a last resort once I get a limb that's too large for these. And beyond a handsaw is probably a chainsaw is our best tool. chainsaws make a really rough cut. Chainsaws have a lot of inherent safety risk. By just starting that machine, you've lowered your safety level quite a bit. They take a lot of training to use properly and safely, and so one of my goals in any pruning operation is not to ever start a chainsaw. So I'm usually looking at smaller diameter cuts to accomplish the same goal as a big giant cut would do, and those smaller wounds then seal over faster than a large wound you might make with a chainsaw. So really caution folks before they pick up a chainsaw and start it. It's
maybe use that first.
Yeah, I feel like if you go beyond this, it's time to call a professional.
Yeah.
And another thing, when I do this, I always clean with this behind just to
get a cleaner.
Yeah, just because I know that the hand pruners do the clean wound. One of my rules of thumb, and I know it's not exact, but I like when I leave behind a pruning, I do identify the bark branch ridge and the branch collar, and it's like, if it's a round, it's pretty good. If you start leaving behind oval shaped wounds, then you've probably cut too far.
Probably gotten pretty
You've
close
probably
to the collar,
got into the collar a little
That's
bit.
a good point.
And so that does kind of lead us into maybe we might as well take a look at our next slide.
Questions,
here.
actually, we've got a couple of good pruning questions.
Okay,
here.
well let's handle a few questions.
Yeah, and actually, Lauren, I see your houseplant question. We're gonna get to that for sure.
Ryan loves pruning, though.
No, we got a couple pruning ones, so I want to get those in here. Okay, so we have a question coming from our YouTube stream here. When is the right time to prune fruit trees in central Illinois? So we haven't really talked about timing yet. So you want to touch on timing?
Yeah. Well, for most trees, it's in dormancy. So trees go dormant after they lose their leaves in the fall and stay dormant until they start to put energy into buds in the spring. If I like to save my pruning, if possible, in the ideal setting till about this time of year, late winter, very early spring, before any buds start to swell. So you can go out and look at those buds and see if they're starting to swell. That means the tree's pumping energy up into those buds in preparation for leaf out. And if you cut those off, you've taken energy away from that tree because those buds haven't translated into a leaf that can return some energy yet. So the ideal time is usually winter, and the later in winter we can wait, the better, because then very quickly after the month of February or so, these trees start to come alive again. They would start to put energy into that collar tissue to start to form callus to seal over that wound. So if you pruned it back in November, right after dormancy happened, you would have a wound sitting there open all winter long and the tree not able to react as well. So that's the ideal setting. Yeah. Now, the reality of it is, especially with shade trees, a lot of our pruning happens in the summertime. That's just the time of year when folks are out doing a lot of it. Is that the end of the world? No, it's not. Yeah. But there's certain times of year that are really critical we don't prune. And, those times would be during leaf out or during leaf drop or during any type of flowering. The tree's expending a lot of energy on those plant parts, and if we start to chop things off, we're taking a lot of energy with each cut away from the tree. So to answer the question of when should I prune my fruit trees, in the next month or so is what I would focus on in Central Illinois.
That perfect time right now, yeah.
I'm actually doing an apple tree pruning workshop at the Food Forest in Normal on Saturday. So we've, perfect timing. We're going to go out there and prune those trees. They're, fairly young, 3 or 4 years old, and we're going to do 2 different methods. We're going to do a central leader method and then an open style method. And it's a little bit lengthy to go into it, so if you want a little bit more information on it, you could email me, and I could give you, and of course, I'll probably blog about it in the near future.
Yeah. Cool. So if you live in Central Illinois, that's a good opportunity to get some real life practice or seeing stuff. Oh, it's full. Okay, sorry. I missed that part.
Yeah, and I'm doing a couple pruning workshops around the area, and I don't know the dates off the top of my head. I'd have to look at my calendar, but email me as well. I have one in Danville coming up and one in Decatur coming up. So, but like Kelly, I think we do try and kind of limit our numbers to some of those, just because when you get much larger than a group of about 20 or 25 people in the field, it's hard to see and it's hard to hear, and we found it's more effective to teach in smaller groups, so they do tend to have a limit most times when we're doing a field workshop like that.
Yeah. Well, and we've also got some plans to work on some videos to show some of this too, so that we can.
Yeah, and why do you want to prune an apple tree is you want to help with your disease and insect issues, but an apple tree that is growing, a limb that's growing vertically versus horizontally is not going to produce fruit, and then you want to really try to get as much sun into the center of the tree as possible.
Air movement, sunlight, it's all good.
It's good to prune your apple trees on a yearly basis.
Yeah, and essentially you're focusing energy on fewer buds for better quality fruit.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what you're doing. And I get the question a lot, like, why do we even have to prune trees? Trees in nature, in a forest, they don't need prune. They all grow and they're fine. And really the answer to that is the fact that all trees evolved in that forest setting with competition from other plants around them. If you look at a forest tree, think about what a tree in a mature forest looks like compared to an open-grown tree in a park. That tree's canopy is developed in competition with other trees, and you'll see a very bare trunk for many feet before those limbs start. In an open-grown tree in a park or in a fruit tree, you see limbs starting sometimes just a foot off the ground.
Yeah.
So that's why when trees are, trees didn't evolve to grow in the open like that. We have to kind of direct the way they're using energy to more efficiently use it in the case of fruit trees for fruit production, but in the case of shade trees for structural stability, to help to prune out some of the weakly attached limbs that can occur. Pruning is just a great opportunity to set the stage for a healthy tree with a good scaffolding of branches in place that are going to last a long time. So
Nice.
So that's kind of the answer to. I get that question a lot.
Yeah,
why
that's a great
do we have
question.
to prune trees?
Yeah. Very good. Awesome. Well, keep those questions coming into the comment box there. We have a question from Deborah. She says she made a pruning cut last weekend that left jagged tissue behind, which she couldn't correct. Is there a way to help the branch heal in that instance? So if it's got some jagged edges on it, anything she can do to
use the
help
hand pruners to clean it up?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, use a smaller pruner.
No, a lot of people used to seal over wounds as an avenue to protect it from infection or insects, but that no longer is recommended because actually it does prevent that wound from healing, and it actually attracts insects and potential diseases and forms cracks in it. And so I wouldn't go out there and do any kind of wound sealant.
Cover it with anything.
I would just take my hand pruners and clean up those jagged edges. That's what I would do.
Yeah.
That's a pretty easy way to clean up the jagged edge. And what Kelly's talking about is our old tree paints or wound dressings that they still sell in every garden center.
Stuff like that.
Yep.
Yeah.
We've just learned a lot more about what happens at that cut surface, and just immediately upon you making that cut, there are chemical changes right there in that plant to block out pathogens, and anything we add there, especially a man-made thing like a paint, is going to inhibit some of those chemical reactions and other things that are happening. So,
and you can, seal in too much moisture.
It's just a marketing gimmick if you see tree wound paint being sold. So
just get that nice clean cut, and the tree will do its job. Yeah. Okay, another question here. They were taught by their father decades ago that when pruning, one should make the cut so that the top edge slants farther out than the lower edge, so the moisture is less apt to collect in the cut. What do you think about that?
I think there's a lot of truth to that. If you kind of, basically what you need to do to make your proper angle of that cut is find the branch bark ridge and go at 45-degree angle. 45-degree angle from that. That's going to probably make the bottom stick out a little bit more than the top. But yeah, it's very true that if you really cut a branch off flat and let water sit on that's not going to be good. So that's something to think about. But I think if you're paying attention to that branch bark ridge and trying to find the angle off of that, I think you'll almost always make that cut with an angle that would drain.
Yeah, you naturally
away.
not have to worry about it. Good question. Keep those questions coming into the comments there. Matt asked earlier when you were talking about the pruners and cleaning them, what's the best way to clean the trimmers or pruners when you're done?
There's probably a number of different ways you could do it. I've always used rubbing alcohol to clean the blades, and it's just as simple as having a rag to wipe these off with. after you get done. Probably bleach would work.
Yeah, I've heard of like a 10% bleach solution. I've heard people.
Yeah, solution with bleach. Anything you can think of that would just disinfect, normally, like a disinfecting cleaner would do the same thing. And, why would you want to clean your pruners? There's some diseases we could transfer from plant to plant. Is it something that I always do after every pruning? No, not necessarily, but I would say in the case of fruit trees, that's probably one place where I would definitely between trees would clean my pruners. Fire blight's probably the easiest to spread of all the pathogens I can think of.
Bacteria is really easy to.
And the oak wilt, oaks, that's why. Not that oak wilt is, a huge problem in Illinois, but it is a problem in Illinois, so that's why you want to prune your oaks in the dormant season, but you would also definitely want to clean your pruners. And don't do as he does, do as he says, and clean your pruners between each tree.
Yes.
Some of us would even say between each cut.
Yeah,
that's
if you're
hard to do.
If you're talking something like fire blight.
Yeah, if I was pruning a tree, if I was pruning fire
sure.
blight infected branches out of a tree, I'd be cleaning after every cut. If I was pruning a fruit tree that there's no history of disease on, I don't think I would clean after every cut. Especially if it was my tree that I knew has really never had any symptoms of fire blight. Probably part of any fruit tree pruning is an inspection for trunk cankers, which that would be one of the signs in the dormant season of fire blight is those trunk cankers would still be remaining. But man, during the growing season, you would have had to have seen some dieback. Of foliage and other things. Fire blight really happens pretty quick on a lot of trees and is pretty noticeable.
Especially in a wet spring.
In some of my, preference to not clean or the reason why I don't do that is in the past I was an arborist where I pruned many trees a day and just, everything from a small shrub to a tree that I climbed up into the canopy of. And there's just, on that scale of that many cuts a day, it's not practical to clean in between cuts. It was practical to clean in between jobs or sites that we left. So, anyway, there's just, it depends on how many cuts you're making, what you're pruning, in my opinion, as to how often you would clean.
Very good, very good. Okay, if you're just joining us or you're still listening, we've been kind of touching on pruning today as our topic, but you can certainly add other gardening questions into the chat box. So I'm going to go back up here to Lauren's question from earlier. She said she's crazy about houseplants right now. Aren't we all? And she's propagating up a bunch of stuff for an upcoming plant swap. What's your favorite medium for propagating cuttings? Should I use a seed starting mix? Kelly, what would you use for propagation?
I am not the biggest fan in labeling soil for certain different things. I understand that things have different requirements, but when it comes to starting seed and doing propagation, I just want a good quality soilless media. So it doesn't have to say seed mix or something. I just go in, what I do? I go into the garden centers and I say, what do you use? I would like a bag of that because they're using the best quality soilless media. I think any good quality soilless media with no fertilizer addition is great. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, you can certainly use a seed starting mix. It tends to be a little finer, but it's definitely not needed.
I think it's a little more difficult to wet down because it has a little bit more of that fine texture peat.
There's a lot more vermiculite in it, I feel like. But yeah, I normally just, if let's say you're propagating cuttings, I just use a good quality soil mix is all I use,
I do think if you're propagating a lot of cuttings, you could go out and get a rooting hormone, and that would make them more consistent, meaning they'll all kind of form roots at the same time and maybe a little faster.
Yeah.
And if you're doing a lot, a rooting hormone would really help.
Yeah, so if you head to the garden center, Lauren, they sell just a little jar. It's a powder, and you just dip your cuttings into that before you put them into that tray of moist potting mix. So yeah, I love propagation. That's always fun thing to do this time of year, get this plant started. Okay, Jeff has a question here. He says, my 30-year-old Magnolia tree didn't leaf out totally last year after the harsh winter. Basically, the east side, which is protected by the house, looked fine. The west side was mostly bare. Should I wait, see how it does this year, or prune out some of the west half now?
So is Magnolia one of those trees that you prune in the fall? Because
Because of the flower buds?
because of
Because
the
of the
sap.
flower buds.
Oh, because of the sap?
I'm trying to remember because I have a list in my head of trees you prune in the fall and trees you prune during the dormant season. Because, like, if you were to go out and prune a maple tree right now, it would bleed a little bit because the sap is flowing.
Mm-hmm.
Am I using the correct terminology here?
Yeah. Well, just good example. The sap flow in this time of year is what we do with sugar maples.
Yeah,
That's why
'cause
we
we're-
collect sap this time of year.
Happen-
Maple syrup.
Yeah, there's certainly a group of trees. I don't know if Magnolia falls into that category of trees that would exude a lot of sap this time of year when you cut them.
Well, and it sounds like it's been a year since this happened. So if that west side is still pretty bare, is it safe to assume that
I
they
think
may not have much growth happening?
what I would try and think about is if you can picture back from the summer, did you lose more than a third of that leaf area the tree would have normally had? If you did, that's really getting into a critical amount of limbs the tree's lost. And I'm not saying if you lost half the tree to write it off and cut it down and plant another one,
Sure.
but it really needs to be babied from this point further if it's lost more than about a third. That's usually kind of my rough rule of thumb, and it's something that's really hard to estimate. But given the fact that some of that canopy may not have made it, I think I would be really reluctant to prune much off that I couldn't tell was 100% dead right now. Mm-hmm. And just because you probably need every single live limb that you would have left in that area to stay, how can you tell if it's dead? Well, a difference in bark color. I know it sounds really stupid to say a difference in bark color, but you can tell a dead limb by the color of the bark versus
different.
others. You can also scratch with your thumbnail some of that bark off, and on a live limb you should see green right inside the bark. If you're not seeing green, if it's a brown color, an orange, or
if it feels really brittle.
Sometimes you can bend them a little bit, they'll snap. But unless you can tell it's just absolutely dead, I think I would wait till leaf out. And then magnolias are going to flower in the summer. You need to let them flower, you need to let them totally leaf out, and then really that next pruning window where it's safe once trees start to come alive in the spring is about mid-June or so in central Illinois to late June. Once you have to let the leaves develop fully and start to return some photosynthesis back for the energy that tree used to push the buds out and make leaves. So I think if it was my tree, I would it's great if you can make a cut this time of year, but I think I would wait and just see what leaves out and deal with it in June.
Wait and see.
Isn't that one of the exceptions to kind of the pruning rule? If it's dead, or really damaged or diseased, then you can make those pruning cuts.
Yeah, a dead limb, if it's 100% dead, any time of year, any time really is probably fine. There's some exception with oak wilt in the worry for oak wilt. And like Kelly said, oak wilt's not everywhere in Illinois. It's in places. We are in the region of the country that it can infect trees. One of the things that happens with oak wilt is it's spread by a bark beetle. So if you make any cut in the summertime when those beetles could be around, they're going to be drawn to your tree because of the scent that cut lets off. Now, if it's one dead limb down by your deck on the trunk of your oak tree that you need to cut in June, is that going to really draw in that many beetles? Probably not. But if you're cutting quite a few, it can really start to put that scent off. So even for a dead limb, that can be an issue. So oak trees I'm just really careful with and only prune in the wintertime. Now, again, if it's one limb that's in the way that you just have to cut during the growing season on an oak tree, I don't think I'd lose sleep over that. I'd get that one limb out of the way for what I needed and go about my life. But if you can wait till winter, that's probably the best with an oak.
Good point.
So he needs to wait, let it flower, let it leaf out, and really look and see which are the dying limbs, and he can go ahead and take those out in June.
Yeah, or I mean, if you feel confident this time of year that some of it's definitely dead, find that branch collar and make a good cut. You can look at a lot of things, twig color, buds. If the buds are dead, that's another thing. So sometimes I'll pick off a bud and you can kind of cut it open with a pocket knife to see if it has green in it. So short of anything you can just absolutely identify as dead right now, I would wait till June. So if there's a question, just wait.
Yeah, and then assess it. And like you said, if it's more than a third, then you really got to kind of...
You should probably take care of your trees anyway.
Certainly.
Right?
Certainly. And
water during times of drought and
all that good
Well,
stuff.
yeah, and I mean, that comes back to the original part of the answer of whether you had a third of it dead or not. And if it is over that third and we're really needing to baby it, what are the things we do to baby a tree? You're kind of going into them, Kelly.
Water when the drought. Think about maybe applying some mulch to help conserve some of that moisture.
And if it is more than a third or a half, then really trying to assess, like, is it worth keeping at that point? It's never going to regain that same shape, depending on how the pruning is. So it's
and the fact that half of it died from not being cold hardy enough makes me think there's probably some other issues the tree might have. A healthy magnolia probably shouldn't lose half of its canopy due to
so there could have been other stressors.
Yeah, so it's just it's all kind of stacking up against that tree being a viable shade ornamental tree going forward. But
and when we had a comment from one of our other watchers here too, she said their magnolia is even older, 50 or 60 years or so, and that last winter was really hard on theirs too. They only had one branch with a few blossoms, and they're still hoping for some growth too. And then they also commented that to remind it, magnolias form their buds in the fall, and you want to prune them after they bloom in the spring, which is
so that's that's an interesting point though. With respect to flowering, that's when you would prune a magnolia. But with respect to plant health, if you had, especially in this case with a magnolia that's potentially stressed, I would sacrifice some flower buds to prune in the wintertime. So since the flower buds are formed the year before, if we prune in the wintertime, we cut off some of the flower buds, so we reduce some of the flowering display. If we wait till right after flowering and we prune it, then there's enough time that plant can add new flower buds before the next year. But I think too many times you read in guidebooks, only prune right after flowering for these kind of plants. Well, in the case where we're really worried about plant health, it probably needs to be done during the dormancy of winter. And you probably need to sacrifice some of your flowering display to get that pruning accomplished in the dormant season. So,
and losing 1 year of flowers is not, if it keeps the plant alive, then it's not the end of the world. It's not such a bad thing. Great point. Okay, keep those questions coming into the comments. We got about 20 minutes or so left still in our show, so I think we're caught up on questions. So are there a couple more pruning things we want to touch on? Some tips and tricks here?
Why don't we go back to our slides and take a look at how a pruning cut does actually seal over. So this next slide here, I have some examples of some pruning cuts. So all these are cuts that were already made, obviously, and in the top upper left, there's a red oak cut and a red maple cut on the left side of the slide, which both are pretty good. The red oak cut is a freshly made one. That was on campus. I think our campus arborist did a great job of hitting the branch, leaving the branch collar. That red maple has started to seal over a little bit, so you can see that little donut shape starting to develop of that callus tissue that is going to actually seal over the whole wound. If we go to the red oak in the middle of the slide, notice there's some irregularity to that donut shape. That cut was probably made a little bit into the callus on the right side where we have less callus tissue. So some of the collar was actually cut off or removed and the tree is not healing as rapidly. The sugar maple at the right would show the same thing where we have an uneven formation of callus tissue. So time, if you're ever wondering if you've made a good pruning cut or not, time will tell.
Yeah, wait and
as
see
that
what it looks
callus
like.
tissue starts to form. So on our next cut, there's an example of a stub that was left on a tulip poplar. So I really like this picture because you can see that callus tissue starting to form at the base of the stub. It really helps me visualize what's going to happen over time here. That branch stub will need to, again, completely rot off and fall off, or that callus tissue will have to grow out and around it to seal up that wound. So this just kind of illustrates what happens if you leave a stub. It's going to take a long time. The white oak at the right is a picture from down the Shawnee National Forest, and that's just a tree that maybe had some storm damage. Those are not pruning cuts. Those are wounds that were broke off and the stubs were left, and you can see a tree will eventually seal over those. Now, how much rot was introduced into that trunk during the time it took that callus tissue to seal over? That's a question. So,
Hard to say,
so our next slide is kind of a what not to do kind of scenario, where the red maple at the left has a lot of stubs left. You can see a lot of those limbs were just stubbed off. They probably needed to prune that to get a little more clearance for the sidewalk or for mowing, and so somebody came in and just cut those off right in the middle of the stem. And the worst case is the silver maple at the right, where it's been topped. So there's some power lines in the back that probably had some influence over why it was topped or shortened. But when we top a tree, we don't actually make a cut at any branch collar. We just cut in the middle of the limb, and it's a really crude form of pruning just to reduce the height of that tree. What it does is introduces a ton of rot into that canopy. At all those cuts, there's going to be a bunch of sprouts that come back out, and they're all going to be attached to a point on the branch that has a lot of rot introduced, as it takes a long time for that wound to seal over. So topping trees, kind of like wound sealers or wound paint, just something of the past that we probably wouldn't do.
Plus, not to
nowadays.
mention, it's really, really ugly.
It is.
It's ugly. It doesn't. The whole beauty of the tree is gone.
I mean, it effectively shortened the life of that tree. That's.
It would have been best
ultimately what would
just
happen.
to take that tree down and replant a tree 30 feet away from the power lines.
Or something shorter, like a
or
redbud.
something that doesn't grow that tall.
But it looks like we're having trouble getting some of the images up, so I don't know if you want to kind of talk through the last couple ones.
So we just had, there was a red maple, like you said, that had all these stubs left behind, and then the silver maple is growing underneath a power line, and so it just kind of looked like they just whacked them all back, the tips all back.
We've all seen that, just driving down the road, how some of those
and
trees can look.
50 years ago, before we understood everything we know about trees now, topping was actually a recommended practice. It was something that somebody would do. Nowadays, if somebody's trying to talk you into topping your tree, they have not caught up with the current science on tree pruning. And so it's something over time we've learned is just not a good practice, and effectively limits the life of the tree or causes long-term more structural problems than that tall tree would have caused us in the
I had a
first place.
colleague call it widowmaker because you don't walk under it, because those shoots that he talked about are really weakly attached to the branch, and then you have all that decay, and it's going to fall on you.
So our picture, had a lot of stems that were maybe this size that were just cut in the middle. So there's so that tree has to form branch collar tissue around here. In the meantime, it's going to send out sprouts. That's one of its reactions when it's just cut in the middle of the limb. And so what you get is when that tree limb 20 years later is this size, you have 8 to 10 sprouts, potentially the size of my arm or leg, attached to that weak point. And so the taller those sprouts get over time, the more probability that they're going to break out at the spot of that old topping cut. So
since we don't have access to the slides, we
do
could
have some good questions.
we could
no, do we?
Sorry to
do
interrupt.
we want to do do
we
we
do have
want
some good pruning questions.
do we want to do the 3 method cut really quick before?
Let's do these questions,
Okay.
and then we'll see how our time's at. So Alina has a question here about a lilac. So they have a large old lilac bush with multiple trunks coming from the same root system, like many of them tend to be. In the high winds last fall, 2 of those broke off at the base and appeared to be pretty rotten at the base. They've tied up and secured the remaining trunks. There are multiple shoots now coming from the ground. What should their pruning strategy be to preserve the bush and promote new growth? So they got some old trunks that are still there, new growth now coming out.
Yeah, well, I like to hear that there's new growth. And,
that's a good
really, lilac should probably be pruned every couple years, and you probably should take out a third of the oldest stems. And do that in the wintertime, take them back to the ground. And what that does is focuses the growth on younger, newer, younger, more vigorous stems that are going to stay healthier longer. So if you don't prune a lilac, that's exactly what they describe there is what happens. That the stems get big and old, and they eventually crack and break. There's some cankers that affect lilacs, some borers that affect it. So just over time, those stems typically get kind of diseased and need to be pruned out. So it's every 2 or 3 years you're going through and pruning out the oldest stems and keeping that shrub like young and vibrant. And so that's the general recommended practice for lilac.
Nice. Very good. Very good. Great question. Linda asked, when should I trim Japanese maple? Anything different about Japanese maple versus others?
Well, one thing with Japanese maple is that it is really sensitive to cold. And so
winter injury seems to be pretty common on.
Winter injury is usually kind of bad on a Japanese maple. I don't like to prune it early in the season, which would, if we look at what trees have a lot of sap that runs in the springtime, it would kind of lead you towards wanting to prune in November or something. But I think I'd worry about just the sensitivity to cold they have and those wounds being open all winter. So I think if it was a really healthy Japanese maple that was in my yard, I'd probably prune it after leaf out and at the start of summer there, just to avoid some of that sap running in the springtime. But I mean, honestly, I think if we looked at the science behind sap running and the impact to the tree, it really, although it looks terrible, it's generally accepted as not that big of an impact on tree health. And I know it seems crazy because I've definitely
because it never looks good.
Yeah,
that's for sure.
Yeah, you prune a maple and there's sap just running out of it.
Or we have a picture in one of our presentations where it's frozen, like it was
the
bled in the winter
frozen.
And then it froze into a big ice cube.
Richard's picture.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think probably if it's a healthy specimen, I think I would probably prune it with leaf on in that pruning window of the summer. So, once mid-June hits and the leaves have fully expanded on all species, like we have a nice safe pruning window all the way up to about September through the summertime there. Once we start to get late in the year, we can actually cause some problems with that plant hardening off if we prune too late into the year, or it's just... Again, it's wounds that'll be pretty open all winter. There's not enough time for that plant to kind of react and do much to some of those wounds really late in the season. So next to wintertime pruning, that summer window is probably the second best. Also in fall we get into leaf drop, which is a big no-no. And in springtime before leaf out, we have flowering that happens, which is a big no-no with pruning. So. Kind of depends on the overall health of your Japanese maple, but I think probably with a healthy one, I would prune it in the summer.
Okay, so. Good tip. Okay, question here about tree paints again. Donnie asks, what about tree paint on oaks if you did prune them at the wrong time? So let's say you did prune them in the summer, still no, or
well, that's a really great question. And I've got this one before too when we start to talk about pruning wounds and paint. If you are going to prune an oak in the summertime, you should coat that. This is the one time that we recommend a sealer. I've always used shellac, so not really a pruning paint of any kind, but that's a good precaution. And again, you really don't want to prune a whole canopy of an oak tree in the summertime if you can avoid it. But if you do need to make that one cut by your deck in the summertime or something like that, use some shellac and seal that up because that's going to seal in some of that scent that would bring in beetles. Now, I've had cases as an arborist where there was storm damage to an oak in the summertime and I had to extensively prune, a mature canopy of an oak tree. Yeah. Well, I was up there with a can of shellac hanging off my climbing saddle, spraying each one of those wounds. And I mean, that just gets to be labor intensive. And, I think that's the recommended practice. I still don't think it's 100% in sealing out some of that scent. So it's just the best thing we can kind of do to put a Band-Aid on it. So don't think that, oh, hey, if I get some shellac, I can just prune my oak tree in the summertime. I'd still say stick to winter.
Still not ideal, but if you had to, for some reason.
If you had to.
Okay. Yeah. Awesome. Excellent question, Donnie.
I know.
What?
Can you? So one of the things that I've been really learned. No, never. I would never disagree with Ryan. One of the things that I've been really paying attention to. I've been working on my pruning research also, is that there's this pruning dose, and I know that Ryan touched on it by saying don't go crazy with your pruning, but when it comes to, a young tree, you're never going to prune more than 50%. When it comes to a medium-aged tree, you're never going to prune more than 25%. And when it comes to an older tree, you're never going to prune more than 10%. So even if you look at something and think maybe structurally it needs to come off, if you're going over your pruning dose, then you're really jeopardizing the health of that tree.
Very true. Yeah, very true. And
I've never heard it referred to as a pruning dose before.
Yeah,
I just read a book on pruning.
I've never heard this term before.
Well, that's
like a
really,
prescription of like, here's your dose of pruning.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. The only thing I would add is that some of those guidelines are for a healthy tree. If you have something that's struggling, then all numbers are off the table. It's like absolute minimum of pruning you can tolerate. Mm-hmm. So
that's a good point.
Because sometimes I'll go to a tree and I'll want to prune this limb, this limb, this limb, and I have to say, okay, I can only prune this one, and this one, and these are going to have to wait for next year because I've gone above my pruning dose.
And some of it is species specific too. There's certain species that we know we can prune a little bit more. Like in the case of a crab apple, man.
Yeah, I was just say fruit trees. You can
apple.
Prune the heck out of a lot of those, and it's recommended a lot of times to prune a lot of.
Yeah. Those. So, but in general, those are great numbers to think about. And I mean, I guess I kind of center on that 1/4 to 1/3 of the canopy, and that usually being kind of my target, because most of the trees, I mean, young trees obviously have a ton of issues.
Structural issues.
Yeah.
So definitely do get outside of that with a young tree. But for most of them that you prune, I kind of try and always picture that 1/3 to 1/4. Now, when you start to look at I've pruned this tree, here's all these limbs on the ground. Is this a third? Is this a half?
Yeah, how do you measure? How do you actually know?
And I've argued with many an arborist over where we're at on a particular tree. Hey, we've already hit the 1/4 that you can prune. It's like, to me, I'm only at a 5th, or I don't know. So to some degree, it's not perfect. It takes some judgment and some guessing, but that it helps you have. It's nice to have a dose.
It's just think that I mean, I guess even though you may look and see there are more prunes than there's all these pruning cuts that you would like to make. Think about maybe spacing it out over 1, 2, or 3 years, especially But usually, I would hope that you start pruning it when the tree is at a young age to correct the structural problems, and then by the time they're older, you're just kind of getting rid of dead or damaged wood. It's usually when people have a mature tree and they want to start structural, what is it called? Structural correcting and pruning. It's a bit too late.
Yeah.
And that dose that you're thinking about, you can even prescribe down to a single limb to think about it. Like, I think one of the biggest mistakes in pruning is a lot of folks start on one side of the tree and just hammer it. And then by the time you get to the other side of the tree, you're starting to think, oh boy, a lot has came off. So if you get it, I've even used it that way. And I of course, I've been up in large mature tree canopies, and you almost have to think that way because you can't even, kind of conceive the whole thing in your head as a whole. But even on a smaller tree, I think it works that way to think about that. And another thing I think about more and more all the time when I prune is the size of the diameter of cut relative to the diameter of the stem. And so, the smaller of a diameter of cut, the better in all cases. And so
heal a lot easier.
Yeah, there's smaller wounds seal over a lot easier, and but it also takes more cuts then to accomplish your dose. So it's striking a balance between that. But sometimes when you're trying to think about, I'm making a really big cut at the trunk here. What could I do to move out this limb and make 2 or 3 smaller cuts? It helps to kind of break it apart by the dose and think about on this limb, I can take up to 1/4 of the limb off and still stay within my dose. But
that's a good point.
I read this USDA study that put together a whole bunch of urban tree studies, and they said that, urban trees really live fast and die young because they're having to deal with a bunch of issues, insects or improper planting or improper pruning or, not wrong place, wrong tree. So one of the things that they ascribed this to was they said that urban trees, like Ryan said, grow different than they grow in the forest, and there is a problem with these aggressive lower branches. And so if that lower branch is more than 2/3 of the trunk, it is considered an aggressive lower branch and probably should be either removed or reduced to get it to not be the same size, because and another thesis, it said these aggressive lower branches have included bark, which is a no-no when it comes to trees because it's not really attached properly to the tree. So it was kind of a sad article because most urban trees, are living about 15 to 20% of their potential lifespan because they're not really being cared for. But you say, hey, they're not cared for in the forest, but you're not growing them in a forest. You're growing them in an urban environment.
Yeah, there's just startling numbers at the death rate of urban trees.
Yeah, I can't even imagine.
And, we're really good at municipalities, homeowners are really good at getting a tree in the ground, and then it's just that follow-up care that nobody even thinks about, where, really for 2 or 3 years, you've got a tree that's in shock that you need to be watering and helping along.
Yeah. If you're not willing to water that tree for the first 3 years, don't plant the tree.
Don't do it.
Because it does require a little love. Go out there and hug it while you're watering it.
Talk to it.
Tell it you love it.
Well, so many of us look at trees and the rest of the landscape, and they don't need watering. They don't need
Yeah.
But that's an established tree.
Yeah,
So till establishment, you should be able to at establishment mostly walk away from that tree if you've planted it in the right place.
And if you've pruned well and it's got a good
unless
structure.
it's like 100 degrees out and we haven't had water in a month, then you might want to water it.
Maybe.
Now, Kelly, you made a really good point I want to go back to for a sec, and that's talking about included bark. And that gets into a discussion of, again, the branch bark ridge. So that little chunk of rumply bark that we looked at in some slides earlier. And so if a branch union is too narrow, if it's too V-shaped
that
instead of
one
U-shaped.
picture where they were coming in and
or the size, the big size.
Or
that thesis said that the size correlated more to the included bark than the actual angle.
Interesting.
Okay.
I'll let you read it.
Yeah, I'd love to read that.
Share the
but
research.
I can see how that happens, and it's because the diameter of that branch is expanding more than the trunk.
It's forming weak angles, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah,
included bark, 5
well,
minutes.
Well, anyway, so just the
question,
concept of included bark typically, in most cases, goes along with a narrow branch angle, and that branch bark ridge gets trapped inside all the wood, the tissue that's being put on there, and it causes a little pocket of rot. So, so that's something to look out for, and that's something in your pruning you can target. A much more wider and open branch union than a narrow skinny one. A narrow skinny one is one I would try to prune out. You had another great point in that
you're on fire.
That large side limb, you can reduce its height as opposed to cut it off at the trunk. And so that's a pruning technique where you go out to the tips of that branch and you don't top it. You find a branch union and you cut at the branch collar, but you reduce the height of it so the rest of the tree can outcompete it and grow into that space. So that's a way to avoid making a 2/3 of the diameter of the trunk, giant wound on the side, and to let that trunk expand to later someday you possibly could cut it off, or maybe for all of that limb's life you're keeping it short and subordinated to the rest of the tree. So
okay, well, we have a couple minutes left, so this will be our last question here. When you were talking about watering, when's a good time to start watering young trees this season? When should they start?
The general guideline on that is a tree takes 1 to 2 inches of water every 2 weeks. That's kind of to actually put some numbers on it. So at whatever point, in the springtime we get a lot of rainfall. Like from now till spring, you probably aren't going to need to water much.
Sure.
It's kind of our wet time of the year. Once June hits and that rain starts to shut off, there's some point in there between May and June where our rainfall really drops. You can just watch and see, if we've got an inch in the last week, you're probably fine.
Yeah.
Just another concept in watering trees is to water deep and a lot in one shot. And that kind of mimics how a natural rainfall happens. We don't get a little bit of rain each day. We get a significant amount of rainfall, and then it's dry for a while. So It's also incorrect to water your tree like every day a little tiny bit. You'd want to water it once a week a lot. So to answer the question, when would you start? Probably May or June, as early as May or June. Maybe we'll get enough rainfall through June that it wouldn't be till July, but I can almost guarantee July, August, September, your tree's going to need some water. So
watch that weather.
I heard it was going to be another wet spring and another dry summer.
We'll see.
That's what they're predicting.
Get yourself a rain gauge. I got a new fancy digital one last year that I know exactly how much rain we got. That
even that, or I'm super impressed with a lot of the different computer programs that really track rainfall like down to your location. And I live in a farming community. I talk to a lot of farmers, and talking to those guys, there's some of them that'll say that's more accurate than a real rain gauge I could put out there, or it correlates really well. So I used to kind of count out that digital data on rainfall being very specific to my location, but with radar and other things and the way they can estimate it now, that's another way you can kind of track that for your location.
Yeah. And that's how we communicate. How much rain you get? How much rain you get? You gotta collect it from everybody.
I'm just gonna call you with your fancy rain gauge.
I'll let you know. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today, either on Facebook or YouTube. We're streaming live on both of those today, so thank you for joining us. We had some awesome questions about pruning. We could talk about trees and shrubs for days, so I'm sure we'll hit on it again later this year. We'll be back again in a couple weeks on February 27th, so make sure to save up those gardening questions and we will answer those for you. Thank you everybody for joining us today.